This is Jerusalem, divided between Arab and Israeli. On the right is the Garden of Gethsemane. It looks peaceful, but the tension we saw last week is repeated here. Near Jerusalem, barbed wire divides a village, and armed police are on patrol. Only the hens can safely wander over the frontier. Human beings must stay put. Relatives and friends may not visit each other. This old Arab's house is in the Jordan half of the village, but over there is the orchard he owns. It's now in Israel. He's not been in it for 8 years. That small boy is his nephew. The old man has never held him in his arms. These Arabs are living in what was the Jewish quarter of the old city. The Jews were driven out in the Arab-Israeli war. But a far greater loss to the Jews was the Wailing Wall, all that's left of Solomon's temple. Jews have prayed here for 2,000 years. Now they want it back. In the old citadel, soldiers of the famous Arab Legion are always on guard against surprise attacks from Israel. Of all the Arab armies, this is the only first-class fighting force. Now come with me and look down from the citadel into Jewish territory. That building is a Jewish post. Now cross the frontier, and here we are in the same Jewish post looking at the citadel. In this post, only 20 yards separate the two armies. Anything I said to the Israelis here could be overheard by the Arabs. Israel has more trained soldiers than all the Arab countries put together, and they're good, even though they've now got less modern equipment than Egypt. Behind the lines, in the Israeli half of Jerusalem, I found a greater urge for peace than I did among the Arabs.
I have no feelings of hatred towards them, except that I would very much like to see peace. As an Israeli housewife and mother of a child who lives 200 meters from the border, I think it's very important to live in peace with your neighbors.
This is the palace of the King of Jordan. Inside the palace, I talked to 20-year-old King Hussein. His grandfather, King Abdullah, was assassinated in 1951 because he was trying to get a peace with Israel.
On what sort of conditions, Your Majesty, do you think it would be possible to have a peace with Israel?
I think a peace settlement with Israel can only be hoped to be brought about is when Israel starts to feel and believe that there are the Arab rights in Palestine.
Back to Egypt to talk to Colonel Nasser, Egypt's Prime Minister, who helped throw Farouk out of his palace. As later on in Israel, I also interviewed their Prime Minister. I've put their answers together. First, Colonel Nasser.
What do you think are the prospects of tension being reduced in the Middle East?
Really, it depends completely on the Israeli attitude. If they continue to adopt their hostility and their hostile policy, I think the tension will continue. Mr. Ben-Gurion said one time that he wants to force a peace, to force settlement. As I can understand, to force a thing must be by strength, must be by war. As long as they are adopting this policy, there will be no easing of the tension in this area.
I'm sitting with Mr. David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel. Prime Minister, what is the present attitude of Israel towards Egypt and the Arab countries?
The same as it was all the time after we defeated the invading Arab armies in Palestine. And that is peace and cooperation between us and our neighbors for the mutual benefit of all the peoples in the Middle East.
What is the Arab case against Israel?
Really, the Arab case is the case of Palestinians, the case of human rights, the case of those people who were driven out of their land, of their motherland, to be refugees in the other Arab countries. This is really what we feel is the most important problem. We have two problems: the problem of the refugees, the 1 million refugees, and the problem of the frontiers.
What contribution is Israel prepared to make towards the Arab refugee problem?
Well, we would help them financially, we would compensate them for their property, and we would put our experts and our experience in settling refugees, as we have settled since the establishment of the state, more than 700,000 refugees, most of them from Arab countries. We will put all our experience at the disposal of the Arab countries to settling Arab refugees in their countries.
Well, on what sort of conditions do you think it would be possible to have a peace settlement?
Really, it is not a matter of conditions. The United Nations have decided a solution about the Palestinian problem. If these resolutions can be put into effect, I think this will ease the tension in this area.
But didn't that include an Arab state inside Palestine, a new Arab state?
Yes?
But would that still be acceptable to the Arab countries?
This is what all the Arab countries have asked. In Bandung Conference, for instance, we asked the Arab countries, and the Asian African Conference asked to put into effect the United Nations resolutions.
But as it stood?
Yes.
Well, on what sort of conditions do you think it would be possible to get a peace settlement?
The conditions is if the other side also will feel the need for peace.
Well, Colonel Nasser said to me that as far as he was concerned, the conditions for peace would be based on the UNO resolutions. How do you react to that?
You mean UNO resolutions of 47?
Yes.
Well, those resolutions were not only opposed by all the Arab states in Egypt, for they were violated, and the Egyptian armies, together with other Arab armies, invaded Israel at the day it was established. And as we cannot bring back all our dead sons and daughters who died in that war of independence, that resolution cannot be brought back. The peace must be made on the status quo.
Sharet believed the best way to ensure the security of Israel was to understand the Arabs and negotiate peace.
Sharet sent Yvonne to Paris, the UN General Assembly's temporary home.
I told a friend I was ordered to Paris to meet Arabs, and he said, "Zima, I know you like Cervantes, but I never saw you as Don Quixote. Will you go to the Place de la Concorde and shout, 'Any Arabs here?'"
I was sitting on the balcony of the UN. A young man came in and sat next to me.
We began to talk. I said to him, "My dear sir, I am a Jew." I looked in his face. I saw no sign of embarrassment.
So I asked him, "Who do you represent?" When I pressed him, he said, "Sharet."
I said, "I am an Israeli who dreams of peace with Egypt."
For Egyptians, talking to Israelis was taboo. So Abdelrahman Sadek was nervous when he was summoned by President Nasser.
I went in and I found Gamal Abdel Nasser standing in the middle of the room. He said, "I want to tell you that you have my permission to continue talks with the Israeli in Paris."
The diplomat's reports were to be for Nasser's ears only.
He said, "I want you to see if there is a chance of avoiding bloodshed."
While we conducted the talks with Abdel Rahman, there was, once in a while, a radical escalation of Egyptian statements about Israel. An Egyptian leader even said that Israel was the cancer in the midst of the Arab world, and we asked them to refrain from such inflammatory language.
Nasser's envoy returned to Paris with promises to tone down the anti-Israeli propaganda on Cairo radio and to restrain the guerrilla raids against Israel. But Nasser would not terminate the war, nor would he establish diplomatic relations or allow Israeli ships through the Suez Canal and the Straits of Tiran. Sharet was disappointed.
Sharet's message said that we were sorry, of course, that the Egyptian government would not change its official policy, which was a clear anti-Israeli policy.
Sharet's repeated offers to start peace negotiations were turned down.
I had realized that the Israelis continuously say that they want peace. I realized also that the Arabs refused to talk.
Israel desperately needed peace. Jewish refugees from Europe and Arab countries were streaming in. Its population doubled during the first 2 years. Its economy was in ruins. New immigrants were often settled along Israel's frontiers. They lived in fear of frequent Arab raids. Ben-Gurion blamed Nasser for the raids. He ordered the Israeli army to retaliate by striking Arab countries harboring infiltrators.
Ben-Gurion knew Arab villagers supported these terrorists. We had to show them that helping terrorists was dangerous, to protect our settlements.
I was called to see Moshe Dayan. A mother had been killed, murdered on a settlement.
The murderers left tracks which led to a village across the border in Jordan.
My orders were to reach the village in Jordan. We had to blow up as many buildings as possible and cause as many Arab casualties as possible.
The tiny village of Kibya on the Israel-Jordan border is in ruins as dazed survivors relate how troops struck across the frontier at night. They accuse Israeli forces of leveling buildings with grenades, shellfire, and explosives, trapping entire families in the rubble. The attack prompts the United States, England, and France to deliver their sharpest rebuke to Israel since its founding and to demand stern action to punish the guilty troops.
After the operation, I was called to see Ben-Gurion. It was the first time I'd met him.
Haron, what I think about him, he's a nice boy, a good soldier.
He said one thing to me. He said, "It doesn't matter what the world says. It doesn't matter what they say about Israel anywhere else. The only thing that matters is that we can exist here. Unless it's clear that there is a price to pay for Jewish lives, we will not be able to survive. And that's what counts."
Ben-Gurion was such a believer in the importance of agricultural settlements that he abandoned the prime ministership and joined a kibbutz in the desert. He was succeeded by Moshe Sharet, who hoped he could advance Israeli security through diplomacy. But his Minister of Defense, Pinchas Lavon, believed in military solutions. In July 1954, the British announced they were quitting their huge military base on the Suez Canal.
We feared we would be exposed to an attack from Egypt.
The fact that the British Army was there served as a buffer. It reduced the chance of an Egyptian attack. On his own, Lavon ordered plans for destabilizing Egypt and frightening the British into remaining. Lavon summoned the director of military intelligence to his home in Tel Aviv. Lavon would not stop talking about the need for action. He suggested all sorts of schemes. We cooked up a plan to hit targets in Egypt. Lavon said, "Go ahead, activate the unit." In Egypt, Israeli military intelligence had recruited young Jews to act as saboteurs.
I was ready to do anything to help Israel. I was idealistic. I was naive. A code word broadcast during Israeli radio's Housewives' Choice was the signal to act.
In Cairo, I went to one cinema, my friend went to another. I put the bomb under an empty seat.
No one was killed and the saboteurs were all caught. The news was splashed across Egyptian newspapers.
So I went to Sharet and said, look, this is the communique from Cairo. What do you know about it? He said, no. This is not authentic. It can't be, because how can such a thing happen? The Prime Minister, doesn't know about it.
After he learned of Lavon's role, Sharet's first priority was to save the lives of the young Jews. Moshe Sharet called on me. He said, "The cabinet is worried about the prisoners in Egypt. We must prevent death sentences." In a bid for mercy, Sharet sent Devon to Paris to reveal the truth to Nasser's envoy.
Devon told me the plot was hatched in the Ministry of Defense. Sharet had no idea about it. Nasser's response was not what Sharet had hoped for. In Cairo, 2 of the saboteurs were executed. The others went to prison, Marcel Nino and Robert Dassa, for 15 years. Sharet, in his office that night, confided to his diary that he was living through a nightmare. "If I do not remove Lavon, I am supporting something rotten that will destroy the Defense Ministry and Army Command. If I do act, it will destroy the party and cause a scandal. What should I do?" Lavon was dismissed from his post as Defense Minister. But the damage was done. Egypt also was playing with fire. In Gaza, it recruited and trained Palestinians for military action.
They paid £4 a month. In those days, it was a lot of money, so it was good.
They were sent to Israel to gather intelligence and commit sabotage.
They would see if an airport was built and come back and report. Others went on military operations and carried out attacks.
These infiltrators, the Fedayeen, were a tremendous security problem, not only for the settlers on the borders, but also in the center of the country. They were attacking places 5 kilometers from Tel Aviv.
The frequent attacks and the loss of lives were not only a disaster for the victims' families, they fostered a profound sense of helplessness among Israelis. The government seemed unable to protect its own people. Only one man could satisfy the public's demand for action:
Within months, Ben-Gurion was back as prime minister. By mid-1955, Nasser turned to the Soviet bloc for economic and military assistance. The conflict now became part of the Cold War, and Egypt received a huge arms shipment from Czechoslovakia. New tanks, artillery, bombers, and jet fighters threatened to render the Israeli army and its propeller air force obsolete. General Moshe Dayan wanted to strike at the Egyptian army before it could absorb its new weapons. But Ben-Gurion felt Israel could not fight alone.
Ben-Gurion became more and more convinced that there is no diplomatic solution for the conflict, and because of the accumulation of arms in Egypt, we have to forestall war triggered by Egypt.
A few weeks later, President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Unexpectedly, Ben-Gurion found himself with two new allies. Britain and France had jointly owned the canal and wanted it back. Ben-Gurion sent Shimon Peres to a secret meeting in Paris.
The French defense minister told me Britain and France were planning an operation to take the Suez Canal back from Nasser. And he asked me, would Israel join them? How long would it take Israeli troops to reach the canal?
Ben-Gurion waited anxiously for the return of his emissary.
Ben-Gurion asked me, well, what did the French say? So I began to tell him about their plan. He interrupted and said, okay, this changes everything. We'll go with them.
Israel invaded Egypt, secretly supported by Britain and France. Within a week, Israeli troops had captured the Sinai Desert. Britain and France tried to retake the Suez Canal until international pressure forced them to withdraw. But for Israel, the war was a triumph.
We achieved our main purpose. The main purpose was free navigation in the Straits of Eilat, which is rather vital. And this we have until now. The second objective was to secure safety for our settlements near the Gaza Strip. I cannot say we got it entirely, but they are more safe than they were before.
The Israeli forces withdrew from Sinai, and the positions along the Israeli border and the Straits of Tiran were guarded by United Nations forces. For 10 years, there was peace along the Israeli-Egyptian border under the UN flag.
Trouble and death in the Middle East. The fighting erupted quickly when Syrians allegedly fired on Israeli farmers operating tractors. Israel used tanks, mortars, and aircraft to counterattack. Israeli Premier Levi Eshkol said, friendly foreign powers will understand the situation.
In May 1967, the leaders of the Soviet Union took a step that would change the map of the Middle East. The losers would be their own allies. It all began with a false report from Soviet intelligence. Anwar Sadat, Speaker of the Egyptian Parliament, was in Moscow for talks with Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin. It was a routine trip. Egypt was now firmly in the Soviet camp. Sadat was seen to his plane by the deputy foreign minister.
The minister took Sadat aside. He said Israeli troops were massing against Syria. He asked him to report this at once to Nasser.
Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was the hero of the Arab world. If Israel was massing troops on the Syrian border, Nasser would be expected to act. He sent for his chief of staff and instructed him to find out what the Israelis were up to.
I went to the border between Syria and Israel. I found nothing unusual. So I asked to see the latest aerial photos of the border area. They showed me photos from the previous day and the day before that. I studied them, but I still found nothing.
The chief of staff found nothing to back up the Soviet report. But then the Soviet ambassador came back to us. He said Soviet intelligence had reconfirmed their report. Israeli troops really were massing on the Syrian border, and the situation was very dangerous.
Soviet diplomats spread the alarm throughout the region, even in Israel, as the prime minister and his wife soon found out.
It was 2:30 in the morning. A secretary came in looking sleepy. He said, "The Soviet ambassador is down in the lobby. He's all dressed up, very formal, and he insists on seeing the prime minister right now." I said to Eshkol, "Let's receive him in our pajamas."
Our ambassador gave Eshkol a telegram from Kosygin. Eshkol offered to go to Moscow to discuss the regional situation.
The ambassador was angry. He said, "You are massing your troops in the north." Eshkol said, "We can go there now. We can go together to the Golan border. You'll see we haven't mobilized anything." The Soviet ambassador said, "No."
At that time, Soviet leaders believed that America was on the run in Vietnam. Some in the Kremlin now sought to weaken America's influence in the Middle East, even at the risk of another regional war.
Мы думали, что в политическом плане, даже если война закончится в ничью,
We believed a war could bring us political gains. Even a stalemate could bring us benefits. Egypt had our backing, both political and military. We thought their forces would demonstrate the benefits of Soviet support. So we were confident that the balance of power in the Middle East would be altered by a localized war.
In Cairo, Nasser had put his armed forces on alert the moment he received the Soviet report. If Moscow's plan was to provoke a war, it seemed to be working.
The Russian report escalated everything. We felt obliged to move troops into the Sinai. From there, we could retaliate against Israel if Israel attacked Syria.
Abdel Nasser did not want a war with Israel. Abdel Nasser was thinking of his image in the Arab world. So he put on a show of strength using the armed forces. Marshal Amir wanted to attack Israel right away.
The Arab media had been criticizing Nasser. Some countries had accused Abdul Nasser of hiding behind the United Nations.
Since the Suez War of 1956, United Nations troops had provided a buffer on the border between Egypt and Israel. Now Nasser ordered them out. The eyes of the world focused on a small harbor at the edge of the Sinai Desert, Sharm el-Sheikh.
Headquarters wanted to expel the UN troops from Sharm el-Sheikh. I told them, if we do that, Egyptian troops will have to take over at Sharm el-Sheikh. We will then be obliged to close the Straits of Tiran. That will mean war. A blockade at the Straits of Tiran by Egypt could lead to war because the straits at the foot of the Gulf of Aqaba controlled Israel's only trade route to the eastern half of the world. Nasser, in the name of Arab solidarity, was going on the offensive.
Our armed forces are ready for war. The Gulf of Aqaba belongs to Egypt. There is no way that we will allow Israeli ships to pass through. The Jews are threatening war. We tell them hello and welcome. We are ready for war. But there is no way we will give up our rights to the Gulf of Aqaba.
In Israel, the people prepared to defend themselves. Their prime minister, Levi Eshkol, summoned his cabinet and military commanders.
I told him, until now, I was not sure what was going to happen. But after the Egyptians closed the straits, I'm sure the situation will develop into a war. The straits are a casus belli for us, and I told him firmly that this will be their end. This will be their grave. We commanders told him, we have no choice. We have to mobilize. We have to launch an attack within 72 hours. If we give the Egyptians more time, they will pack the Sinai with more and more divisions.
The generals saw Israel becoming increasingly vulnerable.
The Chief of Staff, General Rabin, was very worried. He smoked a great number of cigarettes, and he ate nearly all the nuts and raisins in the little basket there. And he was very worried because, not because he doubted the result of the war, but because we were really very unprepared for war.
Rabin asked Abba Eban for a diplomatic solution.
Rabin had said we were really not prepared for war. And second, there should still be some attempt to avoid it by exercising warnings and pressures upon the Egyptians. And then Mr. Eshkol sent me a note saying, what are you doing here?
Prime Minister Eshkol dispatched Abba Eban to seek the help of Israel's key allies. He wanted an international fleet to keep the straits open to prevent war.
I've been asked by my government to explore what these governments intend to do in order to reopen this international waterway to a situation of law.
What do you want the United States to do, sir?
Well, I've come here really to find out what the United States intends to do.
President Johnson made it clear that he didn't want Israel to attack first.
The president had said to Dean Rusk and me, and I'm going to speak rather crudely, get Eban in here, into the family quarters of the White House, so we can work him over. Because we had heard that the Israelis were about to preempt. They were about to attack the Egyptians.
Eban talked at great length and eloquently
He always spoke eloquently, and he always spoke at great length. But what he had to say was very simple. This was a mortal crisis for Israel, and he wanted to know what the United States was prepared to do.
The president, he simply expressed skepticism about the idea that Israel was in danger. He said, "You are not in danger. You are in a very difficult situation, but you are not in peril."
He said to Eban, "We do not believe that Egypt is about to attack Israel. Moreover, if it does, you'll lick them."
To make the point, President Johnson asked for the Defense Department's assessment of the likely outcome of a Middle East war.
We had concluded that if Israel preempted, they could win clearly in a period of about 7 days, as I remember. We had also estimated that if they did not preempt and Egypt attacked first, that it would take somewhat longer, perhaps 10 to 14 days.
Then the president took out a piece of paper and started reading from it as though this was some kind of a sacred text. And what this document said was, Israel will not be alone unless it decides to be alone.
If you go alone, you'll stand alone. That was a very cold-blooded statement. We will not come to your defense if you preempt. We cannot come to your defense if you preempt.
As Israel received its warning in the White House, an Egyptian delegation was heading towards the Kremlin.
We didn't even see Moscow. We were driven in cars with the curtains drawn, straight into the Kremlin.
The Egyptians were self-assured.
Shams Badran exuded confidence. He said that if war came, the Egyptian military could handle it. In fact, he described the army like a wild horse, raring to go.
But the Soviets warned the Egyptians not to be seen as the aggressors.
Prime Minister Kosygin said, "Tell Nasser, if he strikes first, he will escalate the conflict. He will provoke the superpowers. America will not stand aside."
I said, "We understand, but closing the straits isn't an attack on America."
The Soviets made it clear they meant what they said.
We asked about the arms contracts we had with them. We asked if they would hurry things up, especially some spare parts we needed for our planes. We could have taken them with us in a bag.
They were always asking for arms. Every high-level delegation would ask for arms, including Badran.
They did not refuse to supply the arms, they just claimed they had none.
I was really shocked. I thought, how can our Soviet friends treat us like this? War was at our doorstep.
Nasser got the message. The Soviets would back him only if he did not appear to be the aggressor. His commanders were instructed to stay on the defensive, ready to absorb an Israeli attack.
The Air Force chief jumped up. He said, "It will be crippling." He said, "Mr. President, the first strike will be crippling." He said it in English. He meant that a first strike by Israel would cripple our Air Force. The commander-in-chief told him, "If you let them strike first, you will fight only Israel. But if you strike first, you will have to fight Israel and America."
But the war fever in Cairo had become unstoppable. Popular hatred of Israel, which Nasser did nothing to discourage, now swept him forward and drove other Arab rulers to his side. Even King Hussein of Jordan, for years at odds with Nasser, decided he could no longer stand aloof.
In the morning, I got into my aircraft and flew to Cairo. And I was met by the president. I was in military fatigues with my gun on. And he said, "Well, I see you're carrying a gun." I said, "I've been like that for the last few days with my troops." And then he made a strange remark. "What would happen if we suddenly took you prisoner and denied all knowledge of your arriving in this country?"
Soon after, King Hussein signed a mutual defense treaty with Nasser and agreed to put his army under Egyptian command.
We were on the verge of a war. Therefore, any reservations I had in the past to any troops coming into Jordan were removed as far as I'm concerned.
So Israel faced the prospect of war on three fronts: from Jordan in the east, from Syria in the north, and from Egypt in the south.
That was the time when Auschwitz came up. It never happened before. When people spoke, they said there was a feeling we are surrounded. We are surrounded. No one will help us. No one is helping us. And God forbid if the Arab armies invade us, they'll kill us all.
By this point, Israel had been mobilized for more than 2 weeks.